All right. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of MRU's Rational Space Network's Critical Thinking series. Today we're going to examine the question, should universities vet who speaks on campus? My name is Dr. Sean England. I'm a historian from the Department of Humanities, and it's my happy task to introduce today's event. Before introducing our participants, I would first like to thank the MRU Faculty of Arts Endeavor Fund and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship for sponsoring this event. Also, I would first like to share a few words about the Rational Space Network and the reasons behind presenting this series of discussions. Universities in North America are currently going through some interesting times, I think it's fair to say. Almost daily we're hearing stories via social media of events on campuses that cause a great deal of consternation amongst concerned observers. Further, this concern transcends ideological convictions, with some progressives demanding that speakers they deem dangerous be deplatformed, for example, while at the same time others denounce what they see to be the takeover of universities by cadres of radical leftists intent on destroying Western civilization. So there's a bit of hyperbole, I think, on both sides, but as someone who studies history, and in particular I look at moral panics as something I like to study, and I see certain elements of hysteria evident in both solitudes these days. So what to do about that? Anyway, something real is certainly motivating this contentiousness, and I, for one, am eager to learn more about it. And how to learn more about it? Well, hopefully through open discussion. MRU's newly formed Rational Space Network is committed to finding ways to allow all members of our campus community to explore these issues as well, if they are so inclined, and obviously a number of you are, because you showed up to listen. The goal of this series is not to showcase raucous debates between two individuals, followed by a vote of applause to determine who won, like on the debaters on CBC Radio. That's not what this is about. It's not a gladiatorial contest. Rather, we hope that this format allows participators and observers to hear and perhaps even consider viewpoints they would not normally consider. That's the idea. It's a bit utopian, yeah? All right, but we are experimenting with a discussion framework devised by Stephen Brookfield. All right. Each installment of our series will present a contentious question and then examine it rigorously. Both presenters will be given a chance to concisely summarize their positions in, I believe, 10 minutes or so. And after that, they will have 5 minutes each to respond directly to one another. Each presenter will then be questioned by two facilitators who will take turns probing the validity of the arguments articulated by each presenter. Our facilitators today are Dr. Francis Widdowson from MRU's Department of Policy Studies and Dr. Paul Johnson from MRU's Department of Earth and Environmental Studies. Throughout this entire process, there will also be a moderator, who shall ensure that each main participant has equal time to present their arguments and to further ensure that the arguments are analyzed intellectually and in good faith. Today the moderator is Dr. Miriam Nabik, yes, a psychologist at MRU's Student Counseling Center. So, the good doctor will moderate the event, which will end with an extensive question and answer period, inviting members of the audience, all of you, to participate. All in attendance are asked to respect the moderator's rulings. I think that's a very important aspect of this process. Today we have two visiting presenters, both hailing from Ontario. This is no accident. The question we're looking at today seems to me to be much more contentious there than it is here, at least so far. For those who don't think this question is contentious, they should be aware that a number of professors at Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of New Brunswick didn't even think that this question should actually be debated, which seems odd to me. The first presenter today will be Dr. David Tabachnik. via Skype. Unfortunately, the weather did not cooperate, and Dr. Tabachnik is in North Bay, but thanks to the magic of Skype, he is able to participate in today's event. He's sorry that he isn't able to be here personally. He's a professor in political science from Nipissing University. He will argue, yes, universities should vet invited speakers. Sadly, as I said, weather conspired to prevent him from leaving North Bay, so welcome.
Thank you very much.
The second presenter is Lindsay Shepherd. All right, now graduated with an MA in Cultural Analysis and Social Theory from Wilfrid Laurier University, where she founded the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry just this last year. Her experience as a graduate student, I suspect, has galvanized a commitment to free speech that draws admirers and detractors alike. Today she will argue no, universities should not vet campus speakers. So welcome, Lindsay Shepherd. So I'll turn over the event to our moderator, but first I just want to announce that on January 11th, I guess the time to be determined, we're going to have another in this series. The question being, should statues of Sir John A. Macdonald be removed from public spaces? Again, a contentious issue, hopefully to be examined in a reasonable way. Garth Stevenson will argue that no, these statues should not be removed. So, with no further ado, I'll turn the event over to our moderator and wish the best to everyone, including the audience in participating in this discussion. So, take it away.
Thank you, Sean. As Sean said, I'm a counselor in student counseling services, and we get to sit down with students and discuss the barriers that they face to flourishing. And through these conversations where we listen very carefully and we explore new meanings and new understandings, significant change can come about. Now that seems like a lot to ask of mere words, but I see again how meaningful dialogue and careful listening do result in significant changes. And so you can see the connection why I would be happy to moderate in a space that is intended to have meaningful dialogue and to engage in careful listening. So I'm happy to be here. So my task today is to keep you on track. And Sean has already explained that there is a structure in part that we will use to keep things on track, and so I'll be watching the time. The other way that I'll be keeping things on track is I'm going to be watching for what I'm calling hurly-burly moves. And you've probably all recognized hurly-burly moves in these kinds of public spaces where contested issues are being discussed. And there are things like a name-calling, right? Or what I call sideways name-calling, where you actually don't call someone a name, but you say something like, I'm not calling you racist, and I'm not calling you disrespectful. But if you actually believed in diversity and you were respectful of people, you'd never say the things that you're saying. So this is this kind of sideways. And the other way is, of course, that we attack the person rather than their idea. The idea, of course, today is that I'm going to be calling you on those moves when they happen in order to keep the conversation on track and to keep it respectful. If you feel like your passions just can't keep you from doing that, I invite you to leave for a while and settle down outside and come back in before anyone has to ask you to leave. That would be wonderful. If any of you walked in here completely certain about your position, I think Sean explained that, of course, the idea of this is that you really kind of open yourself up to the possibility of learning more. And I also attended the last series, and even though I didn't become any more clear about the facts, because a lot of facts were being thrown out, I did walk away kind of feeling like the word homeland had been made strange to me. That I started to wonder, what do we actually mean when we use that word, and what does it mean to position yourself as having a homeland, and how can it be that some people have a homeland and others don't? So this sometimes doesn't make you any more comfortable and gives you the answers, but certainly leaves you perhaps with important questions. Now, I put some paper and pens out because last time I noticed there was a young woman who was making careful notes, and arrived at the mic with a really good and pointed question. And so I've put some paper and pens out, so if any of you want to use that to make some notes to prepare your time at the mic, please do so. You will have a chance to give a brief preamble or make some comments, but you then will also be asked to please provide a question for the speakers today. So Sean said David would go first, but actually the process is a coin toss.
Oh,
yes. So I'm going to toss the coin, and perhaps David, you can call it, and whoever has the heads or tails has their answer right can choose who goes first.
Okay.
David, what do you call?
I'm going to call heads.
And it is heads.
Well, I would be happy to allow Ms. Shepherd to choose whether she wants to go first or second. It's fine by me.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I'll go first then. Should I use this one? Okay. All right, 10 minutes on the clock. All right. Hi, everyone. So the question today, should universities vet who speaks on campus? My answer is no. And I have two main reasons for why I'm going to say this. The first, I think, is powerfully simple but barely ever brought up. And it's that if you're a part of the university community, part of the intellectual community, you should be allowed to participate in inviting speakers to campus. And the element of students forming clubs and inviting speakers is what I want to focus on. Because generally, for faculty members, it seems easier to organize and put events together because they can get funding, they can book rooms more easily. And so, but I'm saying anyone should be able to. It should be faculty member, sessional, grad student. Students should be able to exercise their judgment. So, as was mentioned, I still run a student club at Wilfrid Laurier University. It's called the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry, or LSOI. And I started it in January. And we would have liked to host all of our events on campus. Didn't end up happening because of security fees that were imposed on us. But our mission was a three-point mission. So the first was promote open inquiry. It started out promote inquiry with the Wilfrid Laurier campus, but we expanded it to be in the Waterloo region of Ontario, because not all our events were happening on campus. The second was provide alternatives to the dominant narrative. And the third was build community, so build a community of people who like to talk about ideas, kind of like what's happening today. So we hosted speakers like David Clement. His talk was Why Canada Needs More Immigrants, Debunking the Alt-Right. Laurier refused to host this, so we ended up going to the Kitchener Public Library, had to pay $400 or something. Then we hosted, most recently, Megan Murphy, who's a leftist feminist. Her talk was, Does Trans Activism Negatively Impact Women's Rights? Again, couldn't host that at Laurier because they imposed an $8,055 fee. So we ended up going to a City of Kitchener venue and paid a fraction of that price instead. And we also hosted Dr. Frances Widdowson here. That one was able to happen on campus because we crowdfunded the almost $6,000 that was required. And that topic was, does university indigenization threaten open inquiry? And the interesting thing is that detractors think topics like university indigenization or does trans activism negatively impact women's rights, they think these are equivalent to flat earth and Holocaust denial. And so I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, oh, do you think that we should be talking about flat earth all the time? And it's like, no, these are clearly not on the same page, and I'll tell you why. Because we need to trust the judgment of students, of people who want to bring in speakers. So how I would measure this, of something that's worth talking about, is does it have social currency? Is it talked about? Is it timely? Is it relevant? Is it affecting people? So my club, LSOI, so for example, one woman reached out to us, and she wanted to give a speech about why women shouldn't vote. And I looked at her proposal, and I was, I didn't even reply because I'm not interested in hosting that discussion. I don't think it has social currency. I don't think it's worth talking about. And then also, someone claimed to have a connection to white nationalist Richard Spencer, and they said, oh, they reached out to him on my behalf, basically, and asked him if he would like to speak for my club, and they said, oh, he's willing to do it. And I said, no thank you, not interested. So I'm not saying there should be any kind of administrative body looking over people, right? I'm just saying let people use their own judgment instead of having some sort of authoritarian body dictating standards. Also, I was just talking to someone who hosts a student club that is centered around free speech, and they don't even advertise their events publicly because they don't want to catch the attention of the university and be the subject of security fees. And this is hurtful because A, the event is only going to be promoted to like-minded people probably, so you're not going to have opposing voices as much as you would if you promoted it publicly, and so the discussion doesn't advance as much. And then also, if you're charging for these events but you can't get as many people as you would like, you're getting less revenue, which means less events. So secondly, I would think that it's undesirable to have yet another bureaucratic administrative body to oversee campus speakers. So practically this is annoying because if you know about universities, this means more meetings to justify people's jobs. It's bureaucratic bloat. And I've been in these meetings, right, where they want to talk to me about campus speakers. And what they do, it seems like they deliberately put people in the meetings with you who don't actually have any power over any kind of decision making. So you can't really argue with them because they don't have any power anyways. And also what's going to inevitably happen is you'll need to, establish some sort of committee to approve campus speakers. So the first problem is obviously who's the judge of that, like who's allowed to approve this, especially in a time where I argue there's a lot of orthodox thinking going on. But also, this committee, I think, is bound to become a de facto diversity committee, both internally and externally. So externally, they will probably ensure that speakers meet diversity quotas. And internally, it'll be the same thing. So is there a trans person on the committee? Okay, yes, but that's not good enough. Is there a trans person of color? Okay, not good enough. Is there a disabled trans person of color, etc. If you don't meet these diversity requirements, your committee is bunk and it shouldn't be taken seriously. So it's this guest speaker committee would never be good enough for anyone, and it wouldn't be able to please anyone, and that's a problem because the university, as they become more corporate, they want to please everyone. And then there are two things I hope we'll get to touch on in regards to arguments that Dr. Tabachnik has made. So the first is from his September article in The Conversation called "Protecting Free Speech on Campus, a Solution in Search of a Problem." So this is an excerpt from what he said. Similar attention was given to an incident involving Lindsay Shepard, a Wilfrid Laurier University teaching assistant. She was chastised by her supervisor for using a Peterson interview clip in her tutorial to generate discussion on gender rights. Shepard claimed that her freedom of speech was being denied. And that last sentence, claimed that my freedom of speech was being denied, is a falsehood. It actually doesn't make sense because as a TA, I was the moderator of a discussion. I don't need to offer my opinion in that context. So that was never the argument. I focused on cultural factors such as a stifled free speech environment where there's a prevalence of safe spaces, coddling in the classrooms, self-censorship. So I just feel like if you can't acknowledge that those factors are going on and that there's a move towards orthodox thinking, then of course you're going to think it's okay to vet speakers, right? And then secondly, in another one of Dr. Tabachnik's articles, The Strange Origins of the Free Speech Warriors, this was in The Conversation in June, he lumps together myself, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, and Gad Saad, so 4 very different individuals. And this is a paragraph. There's guise to maintain or return to a more conservative society where women are primarily mothers and wives, immigration is rolled back, same-sex marriage is prohibited, and legislation like Bill C-16 is withdrawn. Free speech warriors have co-opted the liberal origins of the freedom of speech while not being liberal themselves. So, I mean, Dr. Tabachuk never asked me if I believe that, when he wrote this article, that same-sex marriage should be prohibited and women should stay in the home. Obviously, I don't believe those things. So by characterizing free speech on campus as a movement, as conservative and right-wing, you are pushing people away. And that concludes my opening remarks.
Just a point of order. David, I'm not sure if you realize this, but I think your turning of pages is quite loud on the mic. I just wanted to let you know that.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. I was writing vigorously so I can respond intelligently to Ms. Shepard's excellent comments. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to make the trip. If I could ask the cameraman just to point the camera to the audience, so I can just see who I'm talking to. Hello, that's nice. Disappointed not to be in Alberta. My father's from Calgary. My daughter was born in Camrose, and I actually had my first full-time university teaching job at Augustana University, not too far from you, well, a little ways. So it would have been very nice to be back in Alberta. But I'll get to my remarks here. I have 10 minutes. I'd like to begin with, I don't know if it quite counts as an allegory, but it's a story about my cousin Jeffrey. And I grew up with Jeffrey. I grew up in Ottawa. He's from Toronto, and we saw each other quite often. He ended up being quite a successful person in the tech industry. And sometime maybe, this goes back maybe 15, even 20 years ago, he was in Los Angeles for work. And he was there for a short period of time. He didn't really know anybody. And he happened to be in a coffee shop. And he struck up a conversation with someone else there over the music playing in the shop, and it was flamenco guitar. Now this is important because my cousin is actually quite an excellent guitarist. And this conversation resulted in an invitation. The person he was discussing the music with invited him to basically play music with him. Now, my cousin took the opportunity. He didn't know a lot of people in town, took the address, and within days went in a cab, this was before Uber, of course, to the address. As the cab pulled up to the address, he suddenly realized where he was. He was in front of a fairly well-known orchestra hall. Got out of the cab, wound his way through the hallways of this orchestra hall, came out on the stage, and saw a quartet of musicians waiting for him, with even a few people in the audience watching. This was quite surprising. Jeffrey, again, was a businessman in the technology industry, an amateur guitarist, but there he was. He knew something was amiss immediately because they had asked him whether that he would like to play the stand-up bass. And he agreed. He's a competent musician. Guitar and bass are sort of similar instruments. So he took up the bass, they gave him some music, and they asked him to start playing. 1, 2, 3, 4. He began playing. About 30 seconds in, they said stop. And they looked at his music sheet and they said, let's try this again. And they started again. Went for 30 seconds and then they said stop. And they said, you are Jeffrey Hawes, the well-known bass musician from New York City? And he said, no, I'm Jeffrey Hawes from Toronto, and I just play guitar. Oh, very embarrassing indeed. And they looked at each other for about 15 seconds, and he said, I guess I should go. And they said, yes. Now, what's the point of this story, of course? Were these musicians being exclusive or elitist or prohibitive? Yes, they were all of those things. Would we criticize them for it? No, we wouldn't. We understand that professional musicians play music at a certain level, to a certain standard, It is the nature of their jobs, and guests that they like to play with them should follow that mandate of playing music at the highest level, as they themselves judge it to be. They were not saying to my cousin Jeffrey, "Stop playing music, your music is bad." They simply recognized, however, that his kind of music was not appropriate for their professional music hall. Similarly, the university should vet guest speakers. Because of their training and experience, the musicians were able to immediately recognize Jeffrey's ability, his amateur status. Likewise, both students and professors have themselves been thoroughly vetted to enter into and stay within the university. They too are able to make judgments about what kind of speakers advance the mandate of their institutions. Students, of course, are vetted based upon their high school grades, their relevant experience, and recommendations from their teachers. Once in the university, they are constantly and consistently judged and vetted based on their skill and knowledge, depending on the course of study. Professors, of course, are among the most vetted individuals in the professional world. Through years and years of undergraduate and graduate school, they are judged and rejudged endlessly. If they are fortunate enough to get a job in the university, they are then vetted by a committee of their peers to receive tenure and then promotion. This is not even to mention the very difficult task of peer review related to scholarly publication. Notably, during and after all of this vetting that they've experienced, they themselves are then asked to vet and peer review their own colleagues, and so on and so on. By what standard, then, are guests of the university to be vetted, if at all? My university, for example, has a mandate, quote, of learning through scholarship, teaching, and research within a spirit of free inquiry and expression. This mandate comes directly from the Nipissing University Act, the legislation that gives my institution status as a university and lays out its responsibilities in that role. As is clear from that law, the university embraces free inquiry and expression, but not free inquiry and expression just for the sake of it. Instead, it embraces free inquiry and expression that advances the mandate of scholarship, teaching, and research. In turn, guest speakers are not to be invited simply to express themselves this way or that way, just for the sake of free or open inquiry, but instead to express themselves as a means to somehow advance the objects of scholarship, teaching, and research. Now, while the system of charters is different in Alberta, Mount Royal lists part of its mission as teaching and learning informed by scholarship. Similarly, then, guests invited to speak at Mount Royal should somehow participate in this mission. At most universities, there is yet another standard that applies specifically to students. At Nipissing, by entering the university, students agree to abide by a, quote, code of student rights and responsibilities. Among their many responsibilities, students agree to refrain from, quote, harassment or discrimination in contravention of the principles articulated in the policies of the university, the Ontario Rights Code, or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Presumably then, an event organized by students specifically and knowingly designed to contravene any of these standards might put them in violation of their student code, the one they've agreed to. It's a contract, basically. The Ontario Human Rights Code, for example, which was enacted in 1962, includes protections against discrimination based on age, ancestry, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, etc. So a speaker event specifically and knowingly designed to engage in such discrimination would not be allowed. Of course, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, the body that interprets violations of the code, has also decided that freedom of expression is much less likely to be limited in the context of public debate on social, political, or religious issues in a university or a newspaper. In other words, because of the unique mandate and mission of universities, public debate of issues that are controversial or provocative are not by themselves violations or contraventions if they somehow are directed toward higher learning, which I believe Ms. Shepherd more or less said. All told, while speakers must be vetted based on whether they contribute to its mandates and missions, This is ultimately a matter of interpretation that must be made with both a sense of responsibility and a tremendous amount of latitude. I will end my formal remarks by referring to the inscription that was said to hang over the entrance to the very first university, Plato's Academy. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. Now, the idea really wasn't whether we could pass a basic math test, but rather that philosophy and thinking required at university required an ability to think logically and abstractly, indicated by knowledge of geometry. Those that could not meet this basic standard were barred from entrance. And so, spanning back to the very origins of Western civilization, speakers at the university were vetted, and so they should still be. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Both speakers within seconds of their 10 minutes. So now Lindsay will have an opportunity to speak for 5 minutes to respond to what she heard from David.
All right, thank you, Dr. Tabashnik. I don't think I'll take up the whole 5 minutes because I think the opening story told was completely irrelevant. A musician's mistaken identity and going to someone's house is not the same as talking about meaningful and complex societal issues in an open environment. Dr. Tabashnik emphasized that students are vetted and judged the whole time they're at university. Okay, so if they're so vetted and they were allowed into the university and they're upkeeping their standards of being here, why can't they invite speakers then? Why can't they form clubs? Why don't you trust their judgment if they're so vetted? And as for the student code of conduct and harassment of discrimination, and I think the point was like knowingly inviting people who invoke harassment and discrimination. I don't know any case of anyone who's been charged or accused under the student code of conduct for inviting a speaker, so I just don't know when that's ever happened. And that's all I have to say for now.
Okay, David, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Well, basically, I'm pleased that Ms. Shepherd went first because, in essence, she's agreed with my position. Yes, speakers should be vetted. She herself has said, based on her own judgment, she vetted a number of speakers, and sounds like she exercised very good judgment in that regard, not allowing speakers that wouldn't advance her criteria for her club. She set out a standard, and she chose to find speakers that met it. Sounds like she's done fairly well at that. So she is saying, yes, speakers should be vetted. I think perhaps she misunderstood my point about my cousin. The idea is, of course, not anyone that just simply has a guitar can walk out on stage at a professional orchestra hall. We can understand why. Those venues are for professional musicians that meet a certain standard. And again, who decides what that standard is? It is those musicians themselves. They decided, and they made a mistake, no doubt about it. It was a mistake, mistaken identity, which is kind of a funny story, embarrassing for my cousin. But when they realized their mistake, they said, no, this is not an appropriate person to invite. That's the idea here. Now, as far as my 2 articles mentioned by Ms. Shepherd in her comments, you know, I appreciate it. I certainly cannot disagree with her. You know, she knows what her intentions are much better than I do. My point was rather, broadly speaking, what I called the free speech warriors. And I didn't coin that phrase, but I sort of appropriated it for my article. They have taken up the cause of free speech, which is a progressive and liberal notion in its historical origins, and have used it in a sense as a sledgehammer to advance quite the opposite, a very conservative agenda. I apologize, frankly and honestly, to Ms. Shepherd if she thought I was suggesting that she herself was advancing any of those elements within that list I provided. That's not really how I wrote the article, and I have it in front of me. I probably could find the paragraph she quoted and explain myself. I don't quite have enough time right now. That wasn't my intention. So again, if she took it that way, certainly that was not what I I wanted from that article. As far as the bureaucracy that exists in universities to vet speakers, I'm not aware of any of these committees at all. I understand that Wilfrid Laurier has kind of haphazardly put on security fees for Ms. Shepherd's talks, and I can kind of understand the context. I've kind of commented on this in social media a few times, that in a way the celebrity that she's gained, and again by not her fault at all, but gained nonetheless, has sort of attracted this kind of negative attention, and in a way takes away from, I think, many of the good events and good ideas she's had. She's hosted some very controversial events, or rather I should say provocative events, but I think that's what universities are for. And again, she herself has used her judgment and vetted speakers to sort of match the mandate of her student group, which I really applaud.
Okay, thank you, David. So now it is the turn of our critical thinking facilitators to bring some questions to both of our speakers. So Francis Widdowson and Paul Johnston, you can take it away.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much to both Lindsay and David for agreeing to be a part of this this discussion. I'm very sorry, David, and maybe I will just turn myself this way so that I can say...
no, not too much, Francis, because then I have to face the...
Okay, but I'm looking at you now, David, is that right?
I see you, yes,
okay.
Francis.
Thank you. Good job.
Excellent. Okay, so I think Paul and I discussed this ahead of time, and we are both going to ask questions, first of all, of David, and then we are both going to ask questions of Lindsay, and then I'm going to ask a question of David, and then Paul is going to ask a question of Lindsay. So we'll see how the time goes after we do that. We do have quite a few questions in reserve if we need to use them. At the last event that we did, it was helpful to try to clarify what exactly the arguments were that were being made by the speakers. And so I think that would be a good thing to do again. And so David, from what I understand with respect to your position, is that you are arguing that universities, by their very nature, vet everyone who speaks on campus. And therefore, it's not really a problem to vet speakers who are invited to campus, because we're already vetting students and professors. And therefore, if we're going to, because we do vet anyway, we should vet speakers according to, one, whether they advance scholarship, research and teaching at the university, and secondly, whether they are consistent with guidelines prohibiting harassment and discrimination. So since we vet anyway, we should vet speakers in terms of their ability to advance knowledge and them being within guidelines not to be discriminatory or harassing to people. Is that correct?
Oh, and I apologize, Francis, you kind of cut out there for just a minute, so I'm going to try to answer your question. Please let me know if I'm not quite getting it right. If your question is about the criteria...
Sorry, David, I was just trying to summarize your position. I wasn't asking you a question yet.
Okay.
And so I was...
Sounded good.
Okay, all right, I think that was accurate, I hope. We're trying not to set up straw men and start talking about things which have nothing to do with what we're supposed to be talking about. So, following from your position, my first question concerns this vetting of speakers in terms of whether they advance scholarship, research, and teaching, and the idea that we should only invite speakers who do that. My question is that the universities were constantly trying to figure out whether or not an idea actually does advance research and scholarship. And so how do we know before we've listened to someone speak whether they will actually do this or not? And I can give you an example just because it's often helpful to have specific examples. At Mount Royal University right now, we have invited a few speakers under our indigenization initiative who have said things which I would say do not advance scholarship, such as we had an elder come in and say that rubbing corn pollen on the feet of a child would cure the stomach problems of that child. That's what happened at this talk. Now, I would never advocate that that person should be prohibited from speaking at Mount Royal because they had the potential to impart false information. I would want to listen to what that person said and then make that determination for myself. So how do you deal with that problem of pre-deciding what will advance scholarship and research?
Well, in part, that was my point about the stakeholders in the university already themselves have been vetted. Now, obviously, students to a lesser degree than professors. Professors in their position are asked then to make these kinds of judgments. Now, are they always successful by everyone's agreement? By no means is that the case, but it is a matter of judgment, right? So you would hope that the cadre of professors deciding which speakers they would invite would have the good judgment to invite somebody that would advance the mandate of the university. That's basically my position. There's really no sort of technical or definitive way or bureaucratic way, as I think Ms. Shepherd put it, to do that. It's really a judgment call. Students, I think we should even give greater leeway. This is all part of their education and learning. Sometimes they will make mistakes. That's part of learning. Sometimes they'll have great successes. That's part of learning. So I really don't know what to say. I'm thinking in your example, there was a professor teaching part-time at a university in Ontario that was promoting anti-vaccine theories to her class. She got in tremendous amount of trouble for this because this was tremendously irresponsible of her teaching students this misinformation, this dangerous information, frankly. Again, I'm not a doctor, I defer to those who know more than I. And she ultimately was asked to leave the institution. So I think that's an example where somebody that is a stakeholder that acts in a tremendously irresponsible way, providing dangerous information for students, she basically sacrificed her position there. Now, she was not a tenured professor, but as we know from some recent examples, even tenured professors, if they acted in an extremely irresponsible manner, they too can be asked to leave the institution. So it really matters about who is in the institution and their judgment when it comes to vetting speakers.
Thank you. Paul?
Hi, David. So a question, or actually, a couple components to this question. So couldn't we say that really, no matter how thin we slice it, isn't vetting simply censorship, and should universities be in the business of censorship? But if vetting is promoted, what criteria would you suggest should govern who should sit on the vetting board? Imagine, for example, the case of religious speakers being invited by faith groups on a campus. And I think in that case, it could be argued for many that they're not there really to advance scholarship, but to raise awareness of their religion and maybe even to proselytize. I've certainly heard that on campus here. Who would decide if they could speak? Would you imagine, imagine the logistics around trying to vet speakers from the plethora of faith-based communities on the campus. It would be daunting, I think, the mechanics around that. Would you have every member of every faith group on campus on the vetting board? Plus, when we talk about, these criteria, advancing scholarship, research and teaching, that to me that seems a little narrow. I think a university should also be about raising awareness, consciousness of what's out there in the world, and that involves exposing students to things, I think, beyond simply scholarship, teaching, and research, albeit those are extremely important.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. A friend of mine's wife actually attended a religious university in the United States, Liberty University, which was, I think, founded by Jerry Falwell. They didn't allow people on campus that spoke ill of Christianity as they understood it. Now, was this censorship? I'm not quite sure. The entire mandate of that institution is directed at a particular understanding of Christianity, evangelical understanding of Christianity. That's why the students attend that institution. And so to invite a speaker that's going to attack evangelical Christianity as Jerry Falwell understood it to be, or Jerry Falwell Jr. now understood it to be, seems silly. Why would they invite those people? And it's understandable why they would not. Now, we here in my university, it's a secular institution, and we don't have those particular concerns. Our concerns are, as I've said already in my opening remarks, are scholarship, teaching, and research. Those are very broad categories. You call them narrow. I would say back to you, they're very broad. And I think even your comments about, I didn't quite get the term, maybe higher consciousness or new ideas, that falls easily within that mandate. Ultimately, it's up for the professors and students to decide how to interpret what scholarship, teaching, and research means. That's why they're in the institution, and they basically have agreed to that mandate and those missions. Again, it's a matter of judgment. I do not like the idea at all of a vetting board, as you've described it. There's no such institution in my university, and I frankly don't know of any vetting board that exists in any other university. Maybe Liberty University has one of those. I'm not actually sure. Ultimately, students should be able to invite speakers, professors should be able to invite speakers as long as they follow those codes of conduct and those mandates and missions. It's a matter of interpretation.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to ask a question to Lindsay. And I'm just going to do the same thing that I did with David in your case. And I think what you're arguing is, and what I think we're talking a little bit at cross purposes here, which is what we're talking about is not a student deciding to choose to invite or not invite a speaker. It's when a student group invites a speaker, should the university be allowed to override that decision? So any decision that's made on campus by professors or students, should the university step in? And Laurier had its own processes that it was involved in, but there's some kind of oversight body of some kind which says, no, this speaker, for whatever reason, shouldn't be allowed to come to campus. So I think that's the issue here, and I think that's what Lindsay was speaking to. And you have two reasons why this should not happen, which is that there should be not an override of a student group's decision to bring in a speaker. The first one is that it basically takes the autonomy away from students. Students are budding intellectuals, they're part of the intellectual community, and if you have the university stepping in, it to some extent thwarts their intellectual growth and their ability to sort of engage intellectually. It to some extent seems to me that you're saying it's kind of a very paternalistic move on behalf of the university. And the second one is that if you are going to go about doing this override process, generally universities do set up committee-like structures, and then that raises all sorts of questions about who's going to sit on these committees and how, you're going to have a whole bunch of processes that go on which are going to be very difficult to, come to decisions which are going to be accepted by everyone on campus. So is there anything, did I miss anything in terms of what you were saying?
No, yeah, it's exactly that. And from what Dr. Tabachnik was just saying about how he thinks students should be using their judgment, that's exactly what I'm saying. But when you invoke the question, should universities vet who speaks on campus, you're talking about some sort of external body. So I just don't know if that was considered.
Okay, so in terms of your position, and I'm going to get into some of the controversial terrain here about this, and this is a student group inviting a speaker who has very pernicious views that are very upsetting to people, and we start to enter into the white nationalist types of speakers, and I know Faith Goldy was one of the speakers who caused all sorts of people to become very upset at Wilfrid Laurier. So when student groups do invite, if they do invite speakers, and I know you said that you would not invite Richard Spencer or the woman who said that women should not have the right to vote, but if we're not going to vet, and student groups do decide that they are going to invite Richard Spencer or this woman who doesn't think women should have the right to vote, how do we deal with the impact that this has on, for example, students of color in the case of white nationalists? Because the white nationalists, the extreme version of that, is basically saying that groups, black students, shouldn't really have the same position in society as white students. So how do we deal with that kind of fallout at the university in terms of the kind of political statement that's going to be made?
Yeah, so I think counter events are great. I mean, shutting down is not good. And one reason is because it actually gives more power to the speaker. It puts them in the news when they're shut down. It turns them into a cause célèbre, right? When they're shut down, it makes them more famous in a way. And I think what's actually really powerful is no one showing up to your speech. And I think that's why Richard Spencer partially canceled his college tour that he had planned in the States, is because no one was showing up. And I think that's good. But you brought up the Faith Goldy invitation, so my club invited her in March. And yeah, so looking back on the decision of my club and myself at that time, yeah, it was a mistake, and it was a time where I didn't use good judgment in inviting a speaker. And I say that because at that time, I was very associated with the free speech movement, and so by inviting someone who was, frankly gone on a neo-Nazi podcast, right, and had those associations with the alt-right, there's already accusations of the free speech movement being too close to that, and what I did is I made that association stronger, which was a mistake, and it was also a mistake for my own reputation. There's some clubs like was it the College Republicans who brought Milo Yiannopoulos to Berkeley? Can we name the individual students who invited him? No, probably not. It was just the club. But for me, my invitation to her was directly connected to my name, and that's another reason why it was a mistake. But I don't mind admitting that it was. I'm still glad that Laurier let it happen. I don't think it was good for it to be shut down by fire alarm, but can I look back on it a couple months later and be like, yeah, I shouldn't have done that? Yeah, I shouldn't have done it. And I say that because I know Dr. Tabachnik has been very critical of my decision, so just wanted to address it.
Thank you.
So, Lindsay, just to follow up on the example you just gave, so what's wrong with David's proposal, in your opinion, his proposal to have a vetting policy on campus with a lot of latitude? Wouldn't this have saved you from the mistake that you just described isn't it just common sense to allow freedom of expression, freedom of speech on campus within some reasonable guidelines and advancing scholarship, etc., as he explained?
So I think he actually agrees with me that no one should be overlooking, there should be no authoritarian body looking over these student groups. And no, I wouldn't have wanted them to shut me down, right? Because that would, if people are shut down, again, they become more belligerent and they become more famous for being shut down. So, and then, what was the second part of the question?
That isn't it just common sense to allow freedom of speech, freedom of expression on campus within some reasonable guidelines with a lot of latitude, as he's explained, and it could have you know, saved you from this particular mistake that you outlined.
Well, even Dr. Svachnik said let the students use their judgment. Like from what I understand, he doesn't believe that there should be vetting boards. And so, I mean, that's my whole argument, right? Is the measurement, the standard should be who the students or the faculty member, etc., want to invite, and that's really the end of it. And as he mentioned, everyone who's in the university as a student or a faculty member, a sessional grad student, they're vetted to be there. And so I think they should be allowed to contribute as long as they're not violating the criminal code.
Well, I think we were sort of looking at the Wilfrid Laurier situation and them sort of stepping in, and really the security fees were a way of vetting through the charging of large amounts of money. So they didn't really want us, like they don't charge security fees for all speakers. They charge security fees for speakers who they think are going to have opinions that are going to be upsetting for people on campus. At least that seemed to be what was happening. So I think it's just a possibility in whatever ways that universities are kind of going to become involved in determining who should speak and who should not speak. I'm not sure how that's going to take place, but there certainly seems to be demands, at least in Ontario, that, you know, that, for example, with the case of Faith Goldie, Laurier should have stepped in and done something to prevent her from speaking, which at the time I was very happy that they did not, because, you know, although I totally think her views are pernicious, I don't think that the university should be involved in doing that, because they could just continuously, you know, impose themselves.
So I just want to track time, so we've got 9 minutes, and each of you would still like to ask a question of David.
Okay, yeah, sure. So no, so I'm going to ask another question to David, and then Paul, you're going to ask a question to Lindsay. Okay, so David, with respect to your position, and this concerns the second point that you're making, which is about being concerned about speakers who violate policies pertaining to discrimination and harassment. My question concerns those areas of investigation which are put forward in pursuing the truth and actually engaging in research which are perceived to be discriminatory. And there's a few instances of this that have been happening, and actually this is a research that I did mention in February when I was on a panel with Ronaldo Walcott. And I mentioned the case of Charles Murray, who's become quite famous recently for his work on in the 1990s called the Bell Curve. And when I was interacting with Ronaldo on this subject, Ronaldo said that Murray's work had been completely discredited, and that therefore for universities to invite him was a symptom of like a serious ethical problem And from what I can understand, Richard Heyer, who's the expert in this area of intelligence research, it does agree with Murray. So Murray's views are very contentious, but they're an area of investigation in the university. Yet, many people say that his views are actually discriminatory. So I'm wondering how we resolve this problem of when people are pursuing their line of research, yet their research has implications which many people on campus see have discriminatory implications. How do we resolve that conflict?
Oh, well, this is a pretty easy question for me, actually, just from how I presented it. Charles Murray is a professor in the university. He's done controversial, provocative research that a lot of people disagree with. He de facto has the right, as a tenured professor, to present that material. If a professor at a different university, or even a student group at a different university wants to invite him, he's, if you will, pre-vetted. He's more than welcome to present those views and should be allowed to. You know, I have to say, despite all of my criticism of someone like Jordan Peterson, who often doesn't seem to know what he's talking about, he is a student professor at the University of Toronto in the field of psychology. And again, it's up to him what he wants to talk about. Again, he's pretty vetted. I can criticize him as a professor myself and, you know, let the best argument win the day in that instance. This is quite different than Kate Goldie or Richard Spencer, who are provocateurs, racists, white supremacists, in no way advancing higher learning at all, merely looking to speak at universities to advance their odious agendas, to gain credibility and to recruit new followers. And I'm very pleased to hear Ms. Shepherd disavow Kate Goldie here tonight and say that it was a mistake to invite her. So I think that answers the question.
Thank you, Dave. I just want to remind you of the paper shuffling that we were hearing quite loudly here. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry.
Paul, a question for Lindsay.
Right, so Lindsay, one could argue that in the case of public speakers on campus, that no one is obligated to attend and listen, and so offense could be avoided. But what about the classroom where students are obliged to attend? And you, of course, were propelled into this discussion of academic freedom from a classroom incident. Is there a line in the classroom? How can students avoid feeling marginalized or offended from classroom presenters or even media brought into the classroom? Or do we just write them off as, well, you know, how you react is your problem, you know, you're choosing to be offended. Imagine, let's take a case, let's say in a law classroom, discussion of sex abuse cases involving Catholic clergy, maybe even involving inviting a lawyer who has defended clergy in these instances. Maybe there's a victim or two in the class, and that could be pretty traumatic discussion for them. Is there no room for some compassion here, and would not compassion perhaps be advanced in this situation by vetting?
Well, in your example case, I don't know if I would consider that compassion. I mean, if that's going to be their job and they're completing a degree that they will have to practice in that area, I mean, you're going to have to deal with that stuff, so it would be a disservice to try to excuse yourself. And some other similar examples that were brought up was an anti-vaxxer professor in a classroom, and then also at Liberty University, which is a private university, how we wouldn't have, for example, someone who criticizes Christianity. So the last one, I think private universities are separate. But yeah, I've been mostly focusing on extracurricular speakers, right? Which I think is when we were teasing through the scholarship research teaching thing. You know, who speaks on campus after hours at like a public lecture? I think it's quite different. But I know in my situation, some people were trying to say I had no place to bring up pronouns in the classroom, but I think those people don't understand that this was a class on grammar. Gender neutral pronouns were in the textbook, and I was just not promoting them. I was looking at them neutrally. So some people have construed this into I hosted a hate session and we were bashing people's dignity and questioning people's identity, denying their existence, etc. It was none of that, right? It was a neutral examination of the linguistic aspects of gender neutral pronouns, which is, you know, academic in nature.
Okay, thank you. You have been amazing, attentive listeners. I even see people making notes. So we're gonna make this mic live right now. And we're gonna invite you to come up and offer your questions. I can come on this side too if you would like.
Hello, I've got a question that I think, oh sorry. I'd be interested in hearing both of your responses. I know that the debate is on whether university administration or professors should vet speakers, but as I understand, a lot of problems that we've had with speakers not able to present has been from students, either directly interfering with the presentation or indirectly in very high security costs that have prohibited certain speakers. In terms of the university, when they have deemed someone, David, worthy of speaking at a university, do they have any responsibility at all to protect the event or make it feasible for students to bring in a controversial speaker? Or should they leave it to the students themselves, providing minimal security or charging for it based on how much they think it will cost?
I think, David, you can answer first. Thank you.
Boy, that's such a tough question, and I really appreciate it. Yeah. Ultimately, the university is responsible for the safety of the people that attend these events. So the question is, who covers the cost? In the instance of Wilfrid Laurier, as I understand it, the costs were charged to the student group. Ultimately, that turns out to be prohibitive. So how do you handle a situation like that? You have to make sure it's safe. Is the concern legitimate? That's not for me to judge. I'm not in a position to judge whether people's safety actually was compromised for these events. What I've said in social media in a few exchanges with Ms. Shepherd is that provocation receives a response, and so my concern has been, and perhaps I'm justified, I don't know Ms. Shepherd personally, is that these events have been designed particularly to engender provocation. If that is the case, then that is what you get. You get this security fee, you get protests, you hopefully don't get violence, but you get the possibility of violence. That seems to be the case in many instances in the United States. I'm not, again, Ms. Shepherd can speak for herself here, whether she's just provoking for the sake of it. Perhaps I'm just wrong in this instance, but inviting someone like Richard Spencer, this seems to me just simply to make a point about free speech and will necessarily engender protest. This doesn't invent scholarship or new ideas or new thinking or debate or discussion at all. In those instances, it seems fairly clear-cut that the security fees should be paid for by that student group. And frankly, if I haven't been clear, someone like Richard Spencer has no place on campus, nor does anyone like Faith Goldie belong on a university campus. If they want to speak, they can speak privately and attract any citizen or individual that wants to hear them.
Thank you, and we want to ask Lindsay as well.
The same question.
Sure. So I think the problem is, well, first of all, I think I still haven't figured out how we would figure out this question of who pays for the security fees, because I do think charging, for example, my student group, it's blaming the victim, because we're not trying to hurt anybody, we're not masking ourselves and blowing air horns in people's ears, chasing after people with siren machines. So why should we have to pay for the people who want to do that to us, right? Which happened at Dr. Francis Widdowson's talk. People were chasing attendees with air horns in their ears, right? And so we had to pay the $5,300 for them to do that. So, you know, I've thought about, okay, would there be like a protesting charge? If you'd like to stage a protest, you have to pay a fee. But of course, that enters a new problem of, well, is that stifling the free speech of the protesters? So I still have to work through it. But I think I see a problem in saying that if you engender provocation, you have to pay, and you should expect to pay. Well, for example, the talk I recently hosted, Does Transactivism Negatively Impact Women's Rights? This is something that university classrooms will not, professors will not touch, right? But needs to be talked about. Because there's been the recent case of Karen White, who was in a UK prison. It's a male who wanted to be in a women's prison and ended up sexually assaulting females in the women's prison. So this is an example of when we need to think about conflicting rights, but this is something that a lot of professors will not touch, right? And so am I engendering provocation because I'm concerned about this issue? Well, who are you to judge? I mean, you know, I'm being accused of intentionally provoking, but it's just not the case. And so I worry that people who are just quite orthodox in their thinking and don't really want to rock the boat, they just want to toe the line, they don't understand that we're not trying to provoke, we just are interested in things that the other people won't touch, right? And then there's the issue of, oh, well, get a private venue then, rent a library or something else. But the problem is, it was either in March or April that Janice Fiamengo was speaking for the University of Ottawa Free Speech Club, and they booked it at the Ottawa Public Library, and still Antifa showed up and pulled the fire alarm and it was canceled. So you can't go to private venues either, they're everywhere.
Thank you.
Hi there. My question pertains to the actual content of speakers. So my premise would be that the political spectrum has become out of date. And I've said this ever since the 2008 presidential election, because John McCain has always been, unfortunately he's dead now, but he's always been portrayed as a moderate. And I noticed during the presidential elections that Mr. McCain declared that he'd keep the nuclear option on the table for North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, big long list. He said this in all the debates over and over again. I could not understand why some man, because he's pro-abortion, because he's pro-immigration, because he's pro-affirmative action, can basically declare that he wants to keep the nuclear option open to half the world, right? So going with this premise though, you've stated that you wouldn't allow a white nationalist on campus. Now, my question regarding this would be, how many people are against immigration levels, against affirmative action, you know, what we consider far-right positions, but never identify themselves as white nationalists? So where do we draw a line that you can just say, like, oh, like, I don't know, has Faith Goldie come out and said, I'm a white nationalist? I don't know this, but somewhere out there, there's going to be somebody that holds these positions similar to Faith Goldie, but has made no declaration of such as being a white nationalist. So the question again is, where do you draw the line with this?
It's a question for David, I understand. Yes?
David can start, but I think both have sort of stated, like, Lindsay has stated that she's for students being able to do this, but still seems to have condemned various speakers herself that she finds unacceptable, that she wouldn't go there with. And I just kind of have this issue that, to me, it's not that clear anymore.
Okay, thank you. So I'll give each of them a chance to speak. Go ahead, David.
Well, I think the questioner sort of hit the nail on the head. It is unclear. That's the point. My basis here is ultimately it's about the judgment of the stakeholders in the university. And just to clarify here, and maybe we're not all agreeing on the panel, the university is not the administration. That should be made very clear. The university is the administration, the professors, and the students. That's what a university is. So we decide in a variety of ways who gets to be invited to speak on campus, and that was really the basis of my remarks. As far as John McCain goes, and I think this is consistent with what I've said, as a senator, as a nominee for the Republican Party, as a presidential candidate, now of course he's passed away, so this is kind of irrelevant. Of course he's qualified to speak on campus, no matter what his views are. It's by virtue of his position. Somebody, again, like Faith Goldie or Richard Spencer, they are avowed white nationalists. I think Faith Goldie sort of perhaps tries to call herself, what is it, a Catholic nationalist or something along those lines. But these are just smoke and mirrors here. We know what she is, and she doesn't belong on campus. There's no merit in having someone like that. They're just mere provocateurs. And honestly, again, if you have the intention of inviting somebody who's provocative, that can then advance good ideas, debate, intellectual discourse, that's fine. I don't have a problem with people being provocative. But if they are provocateurs, they're merely there for their own sort of self-aggrandizement, to recruit people to their cause. There's no advancement to higher learning. And again, I appreciate very much Ms. Shepard's point that she made a mistake inviting Faith Goldie. I think she falls in that category. And there's lots of agreement here all around.
Yeah, so you just mentioned how you see me condemning speakers, for example. But just because I wouldn't host them, it doesn't mean I don't think, if another group wanted to host them and the university tried to shut them down, I wouldn't agree with that, right? So just because I personally don't want to extend the invitation to them and fly them out here and put them in a hotel, etc., it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be fine with another group doing it, right?
Just do a quick follow-up.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, just one point I did want to make here on my notes here is, okay, so the Liberal Party of Canada tends to have their immigration levels at around 300,000. Considered far right-wing on the Conservative Party is more around 150,000. When you look at the population of the world and ever growing, we're talking like literally billions of people could want to immigrate to Canada. And this could, like, well, my point is both numbers are a drop in the bucket. If you take 300,000 out of 5 billion people, or 150,000 out of 5 billion people, both numbers come down to 0.00, as a percentage. Not even 1% of people that could be allowed as immigrants into Canada. And yet, we as Canadians tend to go with this, that, the one party says they're not racist, and the other party, accuses the other party of being racist. So when you even use a word like racism and racist, I mean, isn't that even problematic?
Okay, so there's a question there.
Yeah, I mean,
Lindsay first.
yeah. No, the name calling definitely is part of shutting down the discussion, and it's linked to free speech. Is your point that the conservative numbers and the liberal numbers are hardly different, but yet the conservatives get called racist?
Basically, yes. Well, not necessarily even just on political, on party lines, just in general. Somebody advocates lower immigration, they're called a racist. Whereas my point is, with the numbers compared to the population numbers of the world, both parties, somebody outsider could accuse of being a racist. You could have 1 million as your target, and somebody could say that's not enough and racist. So where does, I'm just saying this is, to me, an issue when you come down to numbers like this and throw names around like that. That we as a society don't seem to have any, solid ways of categorizing this in the first place, and yet want to make decisions on this.
Okay, let's give Lindsay and David each a turn to respond.
Should I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree that immigration is something that should be talked about. But then we return again to scholarship, research, and teaching, because if that's something you study critically, like, let's say, kind of in the boat of Dr. Ricardo Duchenne from University of New Brunswick, I don't know if you've heard of him. He uses the term ethnocide, which might be too much, but he's critical of immigration. But if you wanted to enter sociology now, being critical of immigration, would you even get a professorship? I don't know. So if you want to talk about those things, it would have to be not in the context of the classroom.
Okay. David, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we're actually talking about a different sort of thing here by the questioner. We're talking about sort of the world of democracy, party politics, and that's quite different, actually. And I think it illustrates my point to some degree. When it comes to democratic rights, I think all of those kinds of discussions should be allowed short, again, of hate speech. We should allow vigorous discussion of immigration, anti-immigration positions as well. Even racist positions can be allowed. That's democratic processes. We get to learn about what candidates stand for and what people in our communities support. I have my particular positions, but I want to hear all of that. The university, of course, is not that kind of forum. It is actually a very different, if you will, elitist, exclusive forum. And again, the stakeholders in that forum, professors, students, administrators as well, get to decide. That's not what happens in democratic politics. All of us get to decide as citizens. So I welcome anti-immigrant, pro-immigrant, even racist positions when it comes to democracy. All of that kind of speech is allowed. That's part of our democratic rights.
Okay, we have another question. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks again for hosting this terrific debate opportunity and this forum. My question is for both. I mean, we've all seen the protesters who shut down speech and pulled fire alarms, and we all know that's unacceptable. Quelling that's difficult, and it's a security concern, in my opinion, that universities should accept and deal with. It's unfair that a debate like this might get shut down by protesters who are firing off air horns. I really liked, Lindsay, what you said at the beginning. You had a template for how you chose speakers. I'd like to hear you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, and maybe, David, if you could tell us which parts of that you agree on, and we could see maybe together how we build a debate like that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so again, the three-point mission of LSOI was promote open inquiry, provide alternatives to the dominant narrative, and build community. So generally when choosing speakers, we would discuss, does this topic have social currency? Are people talking about it? Is it affecting people? Is it timely and relevant? So, something like flat earth, Holocaust denial does not interest us because it doesn't address any of those. We don't see it as something that's worth being talked about. Even, another, someone emailed us and was because we got troll emails, right? And they were like, oh, I'd like to do a speech about the existence of the Easter Bunny. And it's you know, this is just not equivalent to the meaningful and complex issues that we're trying to address here.
Well, this isn't turning out to be much of a debate because I completely agree with those sentiments. Ms. Shepherd, she's using a bit of different words. She's using terms like social currency, but I use the term higher learning. I think those are quite similar. That's her choice. I think she should be allowed to have these talks. The difficult matter, again, is when these things are shut down. How do you deal with them? That's hard. Not something that I can easily answer. Clearly, somebody who is pulling fire alarms, that's illegal. That person should be stopped, and if not stopped, charged for doing so. That shouldn't be allowed. And so, really, I think, you know, I wish I could be a little more argumentative here, but I agree with Ms. Shepherd on this, in this matter.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
Again, thanks for hosting. So, as I was growing up, I really loved discussing movies, and so much so that you know, I enjoyed discussing bad movies as much as good movies, and sometimes so much that even as I was watching a bad movie, I would still enjoy the process in anticipation for when I would discuss it afterwards with my friends. And so I found that you could get a lot out of it, not necessarily for what a bad movie is trying to communicate, but for whatever other cultural messages that get mixed in there and other inferences that you could take out of it. And so when we look at the academic arena, you know, it seems like a no-brainer that you would want to invite the most intellectually rigorous and robust and exciting, scintillating speakers available in order to promote discussion. But I would like to ask, is that in fact a good assumption? Is it possible that the most fruitful discussions might actually come from speakers that don't quite measure up intellectually to where you might want them to be?
Thank you. Shall we have Lindsay and then David answer? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like the speaker I just hosted recently, Megan Murphy, she's not an academic, right? She is the host and editor of an online magazine and podcast. So she's, you know, not really part of this elitist academic class that was being referred to. You know, the speaker who talked about debunking the alt-right, why Canada needs more immigrants, he was from Students for Liberty, so just from like a libertarian organization, so like more of a professional. And yeah, I think there's definitely room for that. I mean, I'm not really some sort of elite academic either. Hopefully this is interesting. So.
Okay. David, you spoke earlier about valuing expertise. What is your response to this?
Well, if I understood the question, I mean, if the idea is that good discussions and debate and ideas happen outside of the university, of course. I'm sure the majority of it happens outside of the universities. It's not the vast majority. Universities have a very particular kind of mission or mandate, as I've said before, that's decided by quite an elite group of people. If you look at the way universities are governed, it is mostly the professorate that decides the academic content of the university. And these are people who, myself included, of course, who've gone through years and years and years of education. So it's of a very particular kind. And so you're going to get, I think, very good, particular kinds of ideas and intellectual discourse out of a university. But there are multiple forums where good ideas can come from, and as I say, the vast majority don't come from a university. The vast majority of people aren't in a university, but again, our question tonight is about universities, and universities have this very particular mission. So that's kind of a vague answer. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to take the position of a questioner because I think there's an important question that we've been talking about in one of my political science classes about freedom of expression generally and the university's relationship to freedom of expression, which is people, and this concerns people like Faith Goldy. Now, I'm not exactly sure whether there's a difference, but I think there is. Lindsay, if Faith Goldy came and some student group invited Faith Goldy or some white nationalist to come speak on campus, you would not want the university to step in and disinvite that person. David, I'm not sure what your position is on that, whether you think that there should be some intervention to prevent someone like that from happening. So that's the first question. The second question is that in sort of the free speech discussions that happen, people like Brendan O'Neill, who is probably the most articulate defender of freedom of expression that I know, to some extent makes the argument that it's important, even if these ideas are pernicious, like Faith Goldy's ideas, for them actually to come to the university, to have those ideas discussed and critiqued and basically thrown out, because this gives, we have to and this is according to O'Neill, but and other freedom of expression supporters, that these ideas are rooted in societal conflicts. And in order to some extent, diminish the power of those ideas, you need to get people to be putting them forward in to some extent, an intellectual setting so that they can be, to some extent, disarmed. What is both of your positions on that? Is that not that you agree with these ideas, but the university is an important place to investigate these ideas and disarm them in an intellectual setting?
Okay, let's give David a turn to answer first.
Well, this is the whole sunlight is the best disinfectant kind of argument, and that's really, again, not the role of the university. The university, again, has a mandate for higher learning. I hate to be so repetitive here. How does Faith Goldy advance that mandate? She does not in any way. All that we're doing by inviting somebody like Faith Goldy to campus is giving her some credibility to stand in a public institution like a university and give her an opportunity to recruit new followers. Let's remember here that despite all of the attention and debate around Faith Goldy, her celebrity only increased, and she received the third most votes in the mayoral election for Toronto. So there goes that. We understand how these things work. Giving people a big forum, like a university, talking about her endlessly, only advances her cause. That's what she wants. Someone like Richard Spencer similarly so. And again, I agree with Ms. Shepherd when it comes to the idea that we should just simply ignore those individuals, not invite them at all. Now she's saying she's basically saying invite them and then don't show up. Well, that doesn't quite work in the age of social media, even if people maybe don't show up in droves. These things take on a narrative of their own. I just think it's a terrible idea. It doesn't advance the mandate of the university. And again, this is not banning this person from speaking in private in these ideas. Now, again, if you're in the United States, they have a very different sense of what counts as hate speech. Someone like Richard Spencer has much greater latitude in the United States than he would in Canada. Someone saying the things that he said in the United States, if they said them in Canada, it possibly could be a criminal act. And so I certainly would not want to provide a forum for criminality.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, I do think universities are part of the public sphere. My understanding is in Canada, they're mostly, all public universities are partially publicly funded. And the thing is, like, you can find out about public lectures in the newspaper, right, about any kind of topic. So it's not like it's this totally isolated, closed-off environment for people only there. It's also open to the public sometimes to come in for public lectures, and I think that's important. And then again, as for the argument about private venues, is we're now entering the time where protesters will also show up at private venues and pull fire alarms. So you can say that for now, but it's not going to work for long.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
Hello. I know this conversation is about mostly external speakers in the university, but I'd like to ask a question about professors and students, particularly in the performing arts parts of universities, which are often forgotten in these big university things, especially in this province. But I'm at the tail end of a music degree, and we get a lot of the progressive social justice stuff happening a lot in our communities, kind of a big swell before others, I think. And when the cultural appropriation wave started, there was a lot of backlash, both professionally with the faculty and the students, a lot of fear about when you were appropriating, how that would work. And there were people who were punished because you were using traditional musical instruments from Japan or India without having that heritage, and the way that you get money for your programs in a music university is to show people what you can do, and if you're doing that in a way that the public deems racist, you won't get your funding. People were being punished out of fear. Students were not able to accurately express themselves or their ensembles because they were very, very concerned with fitting into what was accepted and what should be. And I'm kind of just wondering if you think a vetting board, because that's essentially what is happening in the artistic programs, is student work, professor work is being vetted for these appropriate or not appropriate things. And it's more a question for a musical group, I think, but I'm just wondering what you both think of that.
Okay, go ahead, Lindsay. You're trying to go first.
Yeah, I mean, the situation you're describing doesn't surprise me, right? And it's really unfortunate because I took a class and one of the topics was, you know, when is appropriation appreciation, actually? And, you know, in the case of music, I'm guessing it would largely be appreciation of the instrument and learning how to play it. It's not like you're dressing up in a sombrero and putting on brown makeup, right? Like that's kind of distasteful. I don't think we should have like these, you know, it turns into the Halloween costume thing, right? I don't think anyone should tell you what to wear, but you can recognize that it maybe is distasteful. But to me, this is appreciation, and so I find it very unfortunate.
David?
Oh, I'm delighted that there was a music question, considering my opening anecdote. Thank you very much. I have sympathy for your position, tremendously so. You want students to be as creative and open as possible. You want professors, of course, to guide them to good ends in that creativity and that openness. If you're taking a course of study where the professor is, let's say, overly ideological or narrow-minded, that's just unfortunate. But that's the person that's teaching that course. It is a reflection of how the university populates itself, how it vets its own professors. My attitude, if it's worth anything, is that I welcome all comers. I, in fact, love disagreement and debate in my classroom. And I judge people based on how compelling and convincing their arguments are. They don't have to agree with me. And so if you've been getting sort of this, you can't do that, it should be based upon the quality of your work, not on some question of cultural appropriation. That seems to me problematic, but mind you, I'm not a music professor, so perhaps I'm a little out of my field here.
Thank you. And another question.
Hi, I just want to say thank you both Lindsay and David for being here tonight. My question is for David. Correct me if I'm wrong, I just want to kind of summarize on what you just had previously said as an answer to somebody's question. You said that something is deemed worthy to be said on campus as a topic if it's contributing to higher learning. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, you are.
So my question with that is, if you are in support of a vetting process or some kind of vetting for who comes to speak on campus, I just want to get to understand what you constitute as higher learning and what is not higher learning. While I agree with both Lindsay and yourself and hopefully many other people that what Faith Goldie and Richard Spencer say is totally reprehensible, but then when does white nationalism become the same as pronouns or any other topic that somebody decides to bring up? If a vetting board gets to decide what is and is not higher learning, could their reasoning for what is not higher learning be ideological or emotional? So in short, who and what gets to decide what is higher learning?
Okay, well that last question is the question I'm going to answer. As far as my definition of higher learning, we would have to have a separate forum for that. Look, there should be no vetting boards, and there are no vetting boards. As far as I know, I'm not, maybe I'm wrong here, I just am not familiar with that term. I, as an individual professor, can invite anybody to come to the university to speak. I can book a room, and people can come or not come. I can advertise it as widely or as narrowly as I care to. That's my judgment entirely. There's no stop on that whatsoever. I can do that entirely myself. I don't need any support from any of my colleagues or any of my students. Students are under a little more, they're curtailed more. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, they have the Student Code of Conduct. I don't even fall under that Student Code of Conduct. My academic freedom is incredibly broad. I could invite, even myself, I could invite Faith Goldie or Richard Spencer. I think there'd be very little that the university could do to stop me now. Again, students will fire alarms and put sirens in people's ears. That would be illegal as far as I'm concerned. It should be stopped. But there'd be very little the university could do. I would do that, of course. My judgment hopefully is better than that. And it's that open. That's what I'm trying to say. The university functions that way. It's about people and their decisions. There's no real bureaucracy as such when it comes to these things. There's no vetting boards. There is the law. We're all under the law. And the criminal code, is it section 318, 319 onward, that deals with our hate speech laws. And that would then be a matter of the government, not the university.
So I just want to check, your question was about what criteria would you use to determine higher learning? Do you feel like that question was answered? Okay, so it just simply, so the criteria that you're saying should be used to determine higher learning.
That's so hard, though. I mean, I could try here. I mean, I'm a political philosopher, so I mean, I study Plato, Aristotle, all the way through the history of ideas, right to the contemporary age. Anything that contributes to the history of ideas I would count as higher learning in my field or my discipline, but that's my field of discipline. I understand the past questioner mentioned music. Now, again, I have appreciation for music. Do I have any expertise in music? No. I rely on my colleagues that do. So it's a group effort here on determining and judging what counts as higher learning. I have my own particular interests, and that's why I've been vetted and re-vetted constantly as a professor. As I mentioned in my remarks, professors are the most judged, vetted professionals in the world. We are vetted constantly. It never ends, and it's happening right now.
Okay, I'd like to give Lindsay the opportunity to answer your question as well. Okay, thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we just heard that it's so hard to determine what constitutes higher learning in the words of Dr. Kvachnik, but he's the one advocating that we need to consider that it meets higher learning, but he can't define that criteria in the first place for himself. But also, I just wanted to point out, it worries me that, you know, we keep talking about Faith Goldie and Richard Spencer, but like, let's keep in mind people like Megan Murphy and even Frances Widdowson, who I've had speak, right? And they're the ones who got $5,300 security fee, and $8,055 security fee. And they're saying things that are, you know, need to be talked about, and they're getting the masked protesters, right? So we have a tendency to go to, oh, the white nationalists. But what about people who a lot of people consider to be very reasonable, and they should have their views aired, but they still get as much lashback almost as one of the extremists. So.
Okay, did you have a question?
Can I interject here? I mean, I agree with that. There is a difference here between a Megan Murphy or Frances Widdowson and a Richard Spencer and a Faith Boldy, but that again is a matter of judgment. I side with Shepard's judgment here. I think we're in agreement that those speakers are worthy of being given a forum, whereas others are not.
Okay.
So that's the hard part here about what we're talking about. It's people making decisions, and those people have been put in positions of decision making. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead.
All right. So I think what I'm worried about, and maybe what most people that came here today are worried about, is that the political and ideological attitude of the academy, the academic professors and everyone as such, appears to be driving the acceptable direction of the conversation down a particular political and ideological path. So I guess this is something both of you can answer, because I don't actually know the answer at all, and I don't know what the solution is, especially after listening to this conversation. But how, other than through allowing all kinds of discourse, speakers, and the like, do universities prevent themselves from getting trapped in ideologically driven academia? And does the university and do individual professors and students have any responsibility to prevent that with their individual actions? If that doesn't make sense, I can try to reframe it.
No, it was, I think, a beautiful question. I think it's David's turn to go first.
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. I agree with you. We do not want homogeneous ideology, as you call it. I really don't like that word. It means something very specific, but again, I'm a political scientist, so let's not get distracted. I understand what you're getting at. We don't want to have a monolithic culture in the university. We want a diversity of ideas. Absolutely, and so bringing people that disagree with the orthodoxy or the accepted popular view really is something that is excellent. I do that in my classrooms constantly. I have dissident-minded views. I have, you know, if I may, sometimes radical views. I have very critical views. That's why I've been a successful academic, and you know, the academic community has embraced me. I've been embraced by the community at my university. I've gone through all of this vetting, and I have definitely run into people of different ideology, and we have open discourse. That's why I love working in the university. The university, I meet people in the hallway, in the classroom, that disagree with me vigorously, and we have intellectual, respectful conversations and debate. That is 99% of the time. 1% of the time, sometimes people get upset and don't want to talk anymore, but that is very rare. My experience at the university has just been incredibly positive and diverse. I'm good friends with many of my colleagues that don't agree with me on a whole bunch of things. In fact, I like people who disagree with me.
Go ahead.
That's all nice. But when, for example, when I invited Megan Murphy, Dr. Tvachnik said that the event was, I can't remember the exact wording, he said it earlier today too.
A circus.
It's going to be a disaster because I'm too controversial to host the discussion, and it's going to take away from the discussion. I mean, saying something like that is not fair, and it's a way of limiting it and detracting and undermining it. So I just don't see how something like that would be in full support of freedom of expression and dissenting views. You're saying that someone who's seen as a dissident shouldn't be allowed to host talks and contribute to the public sphere.
Can I respond to that? Because
No,
I think that's a very specific,
Well, I just want to go back to the person, sorry, David, to interrupt. I just want to go back to the person, make sure that you feel, would you like David to respond further?
I think, yeah, just the one part that was kind of just, how do we, I guess if you don't have any idea on this, then that's fine, but like, how do we kind of know whether or not the university, like how does the university vet itself in a sense to know if it's going down? Alternative word for ideological pathway. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I just don't think that's happening. That's basically my position. I think that the university has these occasional controversies, which are all part of the deal. But for the most part, you don't get like newspaper reports. You don't get the National Post reporting, professor has collegial discussion with colleague in the hallway. Professor has interesting debate of diverse views in the classroom. That doesn't make the news. That happens every day, all the time. There isn't a problem. It's made up in large part. I know we talk about a free speech crisis on campus. I just don't see it at all. There's disagreement. There's people with vigorous views on this. When it comes to something like deplatforming, which is a very sort of specific problem, I'm not supportive of that at all. So in a way, I think your question is hypothetical. I don't think it's real. I don't think that's what's happening on campus at all.
Okay, Mr. Lindsay, a chance to respond.
Well, I mean, this is what I mean by someone who toes the line and is kind of orthodox, and that causes you to not be able to see the problem, because there is a problem. I don't know. I'm just surprised to hear that, especially after almost 2 hours of talking about this.
Well,
you don't see a problem.
I've been in the university for my whole adult life, and I know what you're talking about. Don't get me wrong. I understand that there are people with orthodox and ideological views that, if you will, shove it down your throat and don't want you to disagree with them and think you're a bad person for disagreeing. They might call you a homophobe. They might call you transphobic. They might call you racist. These sorts of things. This is just name calling. Can they make a good argument against you? Can they convince you that your position is incorrect? If they can't do that, frankly, I don't think they're worth listening to. If they can prove that you've been transphobic, homophobic, racist, etc., well, maybe you should, in fact, change your position. That's what the university, again, is about. Not just name-calling, but good arguments, convincing people of the rightness or wrongness of their position. That's what I'm talking about. And again, that happens in my classroom, in everybody's classroom, every day. That's what the university is.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so we have another question, so go ahead, please.
Thank you both for coming here tonight. I'd like to ask 2 questions. For the first one, I'm going to read a statement from Matthew A. Sears of University of New Brunswick, who didn't want to come here tonight. In his statement, he says, quote, "I think one of the greatest disservices to the public discourse about higher education is the way Ms. Shepard's case has been presented as being about free speech, when it is much more properly a case of an issue of academic freedom, of which she, as a TA, only had a very limited amount, and external speakers like Faith Goldie have none, given that they are not members of the academic community. As Twitter and countless op-eds, etc., make clear, no one has curtailed Ms. Shepard's right to free speech." So I'd just like to hear both your responses to that.
Go ahead, let's give Lindsay a chance.
Well, this argument that often comes up about how no one has curtailed my right to free speech, I think what these people are forgetting is that in order to expose what was happening, I had to record a meeting and give it to the media so people knew what was going on. If I didn't do that, if I had kept it to myself and been meek about it, I would have ended up like probably a lot of other people. I would have been disciplined. I might have lost my TA-ship. It's only because I made it high profile and I made people watch what was going on and keep an eye on them that I turned out not, you know, that I got through Laurier, let's say. Got through it, I graduated. But I get messages all the time from people who are in similar situations, and they just deal with the consequences because they don't want to go public, right? So I mean that's why my rights have not been violated, or however he wants to put it. And then as for framing it about free speech, so it's not about my free speech, as I said earlier. It's not about that, because I was the moderator of the class discussion. But it is about creating an environment where students can be free to say things. And so that's why I prefer the term open inquiry, and why I called my club Laurier Society for Open Inquiry. And I never, it's not about academic freedom, that's right. I'm not a professor, so I don't have it. But again, that is trying to say that talking about pronouns in a class about grammar, when the textbook had something about gender-neutral pronouns, that's not out of line either. Right? That's appropriate.
Okay, David.
Well, yeah, I think Ms. Shepherd's got it right here. Again, as far as academic freedom goes, I don't think that really applies. So Dr. Sears' comments, I think, were correct on the face of it. As far as the particular situation, the controversy around the treatment of Ms. Shepherd, I think she was very wise to record the conversation or the meeting she was in. I think she was advocating for herself. I think it was very smart. I think she was treated terribly, and I think the university has suffered the consequences because of the publicity around it. I have nothing but sympathy for her position as far as an employee of the institution. But again, that's her position as an employee. Would I want Ms. Shepherd to show Jordan Peterson's videos from the agenda in my class? Yes. I think it was a perfect decision and very appropriate. And the fact that she was berated for it and chastised for it is deplorable.
Thank you, but then why do you not see that there's a problem?
Well, no, that is a problem, of course, as I said very quickly, but again, let's not exaggerate here. The fact that you had this terrible experience, that again, I think you handled very well for someone in your position, extremely well modeled for other graduate students who may experience the same sort of thing. Doesn't mean that this is, you know, a symptom of the entire institution. These particular professors, and I don't know them personally, so please forgive me. I don't want to make generalizations. As your supervisor, as your employer, that was deplorable again. And that happens, unfortunately, in any workplace. You will have people who treat employees badly, and you were very badly treated.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, David. I'm aware of the time, and there's one more person at the microphone. Would it be all right to give one more person a chance to, if you could have a quick question, that will be the last question, and our time will be up.
Thank you. It's been mentioned that the university is composed of three parts: the students, the professors, and the administrators. I'm wondering, with regard to getting speakers on campus, if all three share an equal role, or if one or two of the three have a greater role than the other. Thank you.
Would you like both to answer, or do you use it for particular?
Yes, please.
Okay. Go ahead. I think, David, your turn first.
That's tough. I think, as I said before, there's different rules depending upon your position. I think professors have tremendous latitude on who they invite. So I guess they would have the most say as far as who comes on campus. Administrators, perhaps, secondly so, they're largely controlled by a board of governors. Again, I'm not as familiar with the system outside of Ontario, but boards of governors have certain policies, so the administration would have to follow under those policies, and those policies are decided by the board for the most part. Students, again, mostly are under these student codes of conduct. Again, my sense is every university has some version of this, and they would be limited by that. So professors have academic freedom, and they pretty much can invite anyone you want. It is quite something. You have to act responsibly with all of that freedom, of course. You don't want to just provoke for the sake of provoking, and that's why you've been given that position, because you have that good judgment. Again, hopefully, not everyone, of course, meets that standard, but that's the idea at any rate.
Okay, thank you. And Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I just wouldn't want the administration to be able to override the students or professors, so I think in that sense, I wouldn't think that they would have equal responsibility. And as for like 2 out of 3, you know, I don't think the professors and administration should have the ability to override student groups either, so.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. I think, Frances, you'd like to say some thank yous?
I would. I'm not going to use the mic because last time I set off a whole bunch of feedback and it was just horrible. So anyway, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and I really appreciate David for agreeing to participate. I'm not sure if this is a sign of a problem at universities or not, but I sent out many invitations to people at Mount Royal University, professors and professors in Ontario, and David was the only one who agreed to actually debate this question, and many, as was mentioned, said that they just thought that the question had been settled and there was no need to discuss this at all. So I think, thank you so much. I should mention as well that my department, the Department of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies, also funded this event through its Innovation Fund. And I also wanted to thank Lindsay so much for coming out. And I have, as a gift, the famous Mount Royal University mugs, which I will send David a mug. And Lindsay, this is for you. And David commented on my Rational Space t-shirt, and I will be sending David a t-shirt and Lindsay a t-shirt as well. And they actually, if anyone wants one, they're $16 if you would like to have a Rational Space. So just send me a note if you'd like to have a Rational Space t-shirt. But I would like to thank everyone for a great event. As I mentioned, we're going to be having another one. We're going to be having 3 events in the winter term. The first one is going to be on January 11th, Sir John A. Macdonald's birthday, which we thought would be a good date to have the question discussed: should statues of him be removed from public spaces? And Garth Stevenson, who is used to be a professor emeritus from Brock, is coming. He had his status revoked because he said some, controversial things on Twitter about this subject. So I thought he should be welcomed back into the university fold and to give his thoughts. And I'm looking for a professor from Mount Royal University to argue the opposite position, which is yes, should John A. Macdonald statues be taken down from public spaces. But thank you very much for attending. I hope to see you again in January. Thank you very much.